First class, with that sweatshirt. Sure you are, sweetheart. That's what the gate agent sneered before tearing a black woman's passport in half right there at the boarding gate in front of stunned passengers. What she didn't know was that the woman in joggers wasn't just any traveler. She was a federal investigator with the power to ground planes and launch nationwide audits. What began as petty racism spiraled into a career-ending disaster federal charges and one of the biggest scandals in airline history. This is the story of how one arrogant moment triggered a storm no one saw coming. Imani Vance felt the familiar bone-deep weariness that only came after a successful high-stakes operation. For the last 10 days, she had been living out of a sterile hotel room in Miami, leading a complex undercover audit of airport security protocols. The project, codenamed Operation Safe Skis, was her brainchild designed to stress-test the nation's aviation security from the inside out. It was grueling, thankless work that involved meticulous observation, feigned ignorance, and endless reports filed in the dead of night. Now all that stood between her and her own bed in Washington, D.C. was a 2-hour flight. She had intentionally dressed down for the journey home. Simple gray joggers, a well-worn Howard University sweatshirt, and sneakers. Her hair was pulled back into a neat, tight bun. After a week of playing different roles, the flustered tourist, the demanding business traveler, the nervous first-time flyer, she just wanted to be invisible. Her first-class ticket, a small but necessary perk after the intensity of the assignment, was her quiet reward. It promised a wider seat, a modicum of peace, and the mental space to decompress. Hartsfield-Jackson, Atlanta International Airport, was, as always, a symphony of controlled chaos. The low rumble of rolling suitcases, the distant chime of boarding announcements, and the murmur of 1,000 different conversations blended into a unique hum. Imani navigated the river of humanity with the practiced ease of a seasoned traveler. Her backpack, slung over one shoulder, containing nothing but a laptop, a novel, and a thick file of preliminary findings that would soon rock the aviation world. She arrived at Gate B-32, where Ascend Air Flight 1142 to Reagan National was scheduled to begin boarding in 20 minutes. The gate area was already crowded, a mosaic of faces, a family wrangling 3 overexcited children, a phalanx of businessmen in identical navy suits, an elderly couple sharing a bag of pretzels. And then there was the gate agent. Her name tag read Brenda in a crisp corporate font. Brenda was a woman in her late 40s, with a helmet of blonde hair that looked as solid as a rock, and a thin, downturned mouth that seemed permanently locked in a state of disapproval. She moved with an air of theatrical importance, her fingers tapping on her keyboard with unnecessary force, her voice sharp and condescending as she addressed a passenger's question. Imani watched her for a moment, the investigator in her unable to completely switch off. She observed Brenda's interactions. A smiling, rosy-cheeked white family approached with a question about their seat assignments. Brenda was a beacon of saccharine sweetness, calling the children sweetheart and assuring the parents everything was perfect. An elderly Indian man followed, asking softly if the flight was on time. Brenda didn't look up from her screen, snapping, "It'll board when it boards. Listen for the announcement." Imani felt a familiar, weary pang. It was a textbook case of what she called authority bias. When a person in a uniform, any uniform, uses their minuscule amount of power to create a hierarchy based on their own prejudices. It was one of the many human factors that could compromise security, a tiny crack in the system that could be exploited. Finally, the announcement for pre-boarding crackled to life. "We now invite our first-class passengers to begin boarding. Please have your boarding pass and a valid government-issued ID ready for inspection." Imani joined the short line. When it was her turn, she stepped forward and placed her phone displaying the digital boarding pass on the scanner. She then held out her United States passport. Brenda glanced at the boarding pass, then at Imani, then at the passport. Her eyes, cold and assessing, traveled from Imani's simple sweatshirt down to her sneakers and back up to her face. The fake smile she'd given the family moments before had vanished, replaced by a flat, challenging stare. "A passport for a domestic flight?" Brenda asked, her tone dripping with suspicion. "It's my primary form of government ID. It's valid," Imani replied, her voice even and calm. She had used it all week without issue. It was standard practice. Brenda took the dark blue booklet, her fingers flipping through it with a dismissive air. She held it up to the light, angled it, and then squinted at the photo. "This picture doesn't look much like you." Imani stood still. The photo was 5 years old, but it was unmistakably her. "My face has changed less than you'd think," she said, still keeping her tone light. Brenda let out a short, derisive laugh. "Funny. You look younger here, happier." She tapped a manicured nail on the data page. "Imani Vance, Doctor of what philosophy?" "Let me guess, art history." The microaggressions were piling up, each one a tiny paper cut. Imani recognized the pattern instantly. It was a script she had seen play out countless times, not just in her work, but in her life. The questioning of her credentials, the insinuation of dishonesty, the challenge to her very presence in a space where Brenda felt she didn't belong. "My doctorate is in aeronautical engineering," Imani stated, her voice losing its lightness and taking on a professional clarity. "Is there a problem with the document, or may I board the plane?" The directness of the question seemed to provoke Brenda, her lips tightening into a razor-thin line. "There's a problem with me believing this is a legitimate document," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, yet loud enough for the people behind Imani to hear. "First class, a brand new passport. It just doesn't add up." The passport wasn't new. The cover was pristine because Imani treated her federal documents with the respect they deserved. The accusation hung in the air, thick and ugly. The people in line behind her began to shift uncomfortably. "I can assure you it's legitimate," Imani said, her patience wearing thin. "It was issued by the U.S. Department of State. You can verify its authenticity using your system. I'd like to get to my seat." Brenda leaned forward, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. "Or maybe you bought it. People like you can be very resourceful. I've seen it all. Fake IDs, fake credit cards." She looked Imani up and down again. "Fake everything." Imani's blood ran cold. The insult was no longer veiled. It was a direct, racist assault delivered under the fluorescent lights of a public airport under the guise of corporate authority. She knew she had to de-escalate to follow the protocols she herself had written for handling uncooperative personnel. But she was also human, and the exhaustion of her week, coupled with the sheer audacity of the attack, was beginning to fray her composure. "Ma'am," Imani said, her voice now hard as steel, "you are making serious, unfounded accusations. Scan the document, verify it, or call your supervisor, but you will not stand here and slander me." Brenda seemed to relish the confrontation. It was exactly what she wanted. She held the passport up between her thumb and forefinger like it was a contaminated object. "Oh, I'll do more than that," she hissed, her eyes gleaming with a strange, vindictive fire. "I'm going to resolve this situation right now." And with a sudden, sharp twist of her wrists, she ripped the passport in two. The sound was shockingly loud in the relative quiet of the boarding area, a soft, tearing sound that seemed to suck all the air out of the space around them. The two halves of the blue booklet with Imani's pristine photo and the national seal now severed fluttered from Brenda's fingers and landed on the counter with a quiet finality. For a moment, there was absolute silence. The passengers in line stared, mouths agape. Brenda stood with her chest puffed out, a triumphant look on her face, as if she had just vanquished a great evil. Imani looked down at the 2 pieces of her passport. The document that had taken her across the world, the symbol of her citizenship, the proof of her identity, lay in ruins. And in that moment, the weary traveler, the invisible woman in sweats, ceased to exist. In her place, Imani Vance, the federal investigator, the architect of Operation Safe Skis, took over. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a surge of ice-cold, crystalline focus. Brenda had no idea what she had just done. She thought she had won a small, petty battle against a person she deemed unworthy. She couldn't have been more wrong. She had just started a war. The silence that followed the ripping of the passport was profound. It was a vacuum, a void, where the normal hum of the airport had been. Every eye at gate B32 was now locked on the scene at the boarding counter. The businessmen had stopped their hushed conversations. The kids in the family group were frozen, their boisterous energy instantly extinguished. A young woman standing a few people back in the economy line instinctively raised her phone, its camera lens a small, dark, unblinking eye. Brenda seemed to bask in the attention. She crossed her arms, a smug, self-satisfied smirk etched onto her face. She had made her point. She had in her mind exposed a fraud and protected the integrity of her airline. She was the hero of her own small, ugly story. Imani did not look at Brenda. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. Her gaze was fixed on the 2 halves of her passport lying on the worn laminate countertop. The crisp edges of the tear were a visceral wound. She saw the severed eagle on the Great Seal of the United States, a symbol of the nation she served, now bisected by an act of petty malice. She slowly raised her eyes and met Brenda's triumphant stare. Brenda expected hysterics. She expected a tirade, tears, a satisfying meltdown that would justify her actions. What she got was something far more unnerving: absolute stillness. Imani's face was a mask of placid control, but her eyes held a new intensity, a focus so sharp and penetrating, it felt like a physical force. The air crackled between them. "You have just destroyed a United States federal document," Imani said. Her voice was quiet, almost conversational, yet it carried with an unnatural clarity through the silent gate area. It was not the voice of a victim. It was the voice of an assessor, a judge. "That is a federal offense. Title 18, Section 1543 of the U.S. Code. Mutilation or alteration of a passport. It carries a penalty of up to 25 years in prison." Brenda's smirk faltered for the first time. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. She had been expecting accusations of racism, not citations of federal law. "It was a fake," she stammered, her bravado starting to sound hollow. "I was within my rights as an agent of this airline to—" "You were not," Imani cut her off. Her voice still level, but now edged with an authority that was impossible to ignore. "You had a procedure. A procedure you have been trained on, I assume. You are to use the document scanner and the UV light system to verify its features. If you still have doubts, you are to contact a supervisor and airport security. At no point does that procedure involve you, a private citizen, employed by a corporation unilaterally deciding to destroy federal property. You did not follow procedure." "Why?" The question hung in the air. It wasn't an angry outburst, it was an interrogative. The young woman with the phone took a subtle step closer. I used my discretion, Brenda said, her voice gaining a desperate defensive edge. The safety and security of this flight is my responsibility. Your responsibility is to follow the law and your company's regulations, Imani countered, taking a deliberate step away from the counter, creating a space of command. She reached into her backpack, her movements unhurried and precise. Brenda flinched, as if expecting a weapon. Instead, Imani pulled out her phone. She didn't dial 911. She tapped a single contact on her favorites list. As the phone rang, she spoke, her voice still directed at Brenda, but intended for the entire captive audience. Let me tell you what you've done, Brenda. You didn't just break the law. You have, with your discretion, compromised the very security you claim to be protecting. An individual who demonstrates such poor judgment, who allows personal bias to dictate their actions, and who is willing to escalate a situation so recklessly is not a guardian of safety. They are a liability. A massive, gaping liability. The phone clicked on the other end. Imani's demeanor shifted again. The hard edge in her voice softened, replaced by a tone of brisk professional urgency. Director Evans, this is Vance. Apologies for the direct call. I'm at Hartsfield-Jackson Gate, B32. I'm invoking a code black on Operation Safe Skis. I have an active security breach and willful destruction of federal property by an agent of Ascend Air. I need TSA OIG and the FBI's airport liaison team on site immediately. And get me a direct line to the legal department at Ascend Air's corporate headquarters. Inform them they are about to be in breach of their operating certificate. The name Operation Safe Skis and the mention of the FBI sent a ripple of shock through the onlookers. The businessmen looked at each other, their eyebrows raised. Brenda's face had gone from smug to uncertain to now a pale shade of gray. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, slack-jawed mask of disbelief. No, you're lying, Brenda whispered the words, catching in her throat. You're nobody. Imani ended her call and looked directly at Brenda. The mask of the weary traveler was gone, completely burned away by the fire of her purpose. Now she was every inch the federal officer. My name, she said, her voice resonating with the full weight of her authority, is Imani Vance. I am the Senior Field Inspector for the Federal Aviation Administration's Office of National Security and Incident Response. The operation I have been leading for the past 10 days is a national audit of your airline's compliance with federal security mandates. Your actions here today, your profiling, your disregard for protocol, and your criminal destruction of my credentials have not just inconvenienced a passenger. You have provided a live, documented, and frankly spectacular example of exactly the kind of systemic failure we are here to identify and eradicate. She paused, letting the words sink in. So, to answer my earlier question, Brenda, why didn't you follow procedure? Was it inadequate training, or was it something else? Brenda was speechless. Her mind was a whirlwind of denial and panic. This couldn't be happening. The woman in the college sweatshirt, the one she had pegged as a fraud, couldn't be some high-level government agent. It was a trick, a bluff. Just then, a harried-looking man in a slightly too tight suit rushed toward the gate. What the hell is going on here? He demanded, his name tag identifying him as Frank Miller, the station supervisor. Brenda, what did you do? We have a flight to board. Brenda turned to him, her eyes wide with desperation. Frank, this woman she was trying to board with a fake passport. It was a cheap forgery. I confiscated it. She gestured vaguely at the 2 pieces on the counter, avoiding the fact that she had been the one to tear it. Frank looked from Brenda's panicked face to Imani's icily calm one. His default setting was to back his employee to smooth things over and get the plane out on time. That was his job. Delays cost money. Ma'am, He began, his voice a practiced, placating drone. "I'm sure we can sort this out. If there's an issue with your ID..." "Your time to sort this out has passed, Mr. Miller," Imani said, her eyes flicking to his name tag. "Your employee has committed a felony. Your airline is now under active investigation by the FAA. Effective immediately, Flight 1142 will not be departing. This gate is now a federal investigation scene. Nothing," she said, her gaze sweeping over the counter, "is to be touched." As if on cue, 2 uniformed airport police officers appeared at the end of the jet bridge, their expressions serious. They were followed by 2 more individuals in sharp, dark suits who moved with the unmistakable confidence of federal agents. The hum of the airport was returning, but now it was layered with the crackle of police radios and the urgent murmurs of the crowd. Brenda looked at the approaching officers, then at the 2 halves of the passport, then at Imani's unyielding face. The reality of the situation finally crashed down upon her. A tidal wave of pure, undiluted horror. The smugness, the power, the vindictive pleasure, it all evaporated, replaced by a raw, primal fear. She hadn't just made a mistake. She had ended her career. She destroyed her life. And it had all happened in the span of 5 minutes, starting with a sneer and ending with the soft, tearing sound of her own ruin. The arrival of law enforcement flipped a switch in the atmosphere at Gate B32. The scene transformed from a shocking spectacle into a formal proceeding. The 2 airport police officers, stern and professional, immediately established a perimeter. "Folks, we're going to need you to clear the area," one of them announced, his voice brooking no argument. "Please step back from the gate." The passengers who had been a captive audience now shuffled backward, a low wave of murmuring rippling through them. They were no longer just witnesses, they were now bystanders to an official incident. The young woman who had been filming lowered her phone, but didn't stop the recording, letting it hang by her side, its lens still drinking in the scene. The 2 plainclothes agents from the FBI's Airport Liaison Office approached Imani, directly bypassing everyone else. One was a tall man with a calm demeanor. The other was a shorter woman with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Vance," the man asked, his voice low and respectful. "Agent Davies, this is Agent Chen. We got the call from Director Evans. What's the situation?" Before Imani could answer, Frank, the station supervisor, stepped forward, his face a mask of bewildered indignation. "Hold on. Who's in charge here? This is an Ascend air gate. This is my station. This woman," he gestured at Imani, his voice rising, "is making threats and disrupting our operation." Agent Chen turned her head slowly to look at Frank, her expression utterly unimpressed. "Sir," she said, her voice flat and cold, "the moment a federal crime is committed on airport property, jurisdiction shifts. Right now, we are in charge. Please step back and do not interfere." Frank's mouth opened and closed silently. The corporate rulebook he lived by was being shredded before his eyes. His authority, which he wielded with such self-importance within the confines of the terminal, meant nothing here. He was out of his depth, a middle manager caught in a riptide of federal power. Imani addressed the agents, her tone all business. "Agent Davies, Agent Chen, thank you for the prompt response. Subject," she nodded towards Brenda, who was now visibly trembling, "is an Ascend Airgate agent. She refused to accept my valid U.S. passport for a domestic flight." After a series of unprofessional and biased comments, she proceeded to deliberately destroy the document. She pointed to the 2 halves of the passport on the counter. "That is the evidence. I need it collected and preserved. The subject's name is Brenda, surname unknown at this time. The station supervisor is Frank Miller." Agent Davies nodded, pulling on a pair of nitrile gloves from his pocket. He carefully used a pair of tweezers to pick up the 2 pieces of the passport and place them in an evidence bag. The simple procedural act seemed to seal Brenda's fate more than anything else had. It was no longer an argument. It was evidence in a federal case. The gate's security cameras will have captured the entire interaction. Imani continued, her mind working like a finely tuned machine, cataloging every necessary step. I need that footage pulled immediately from all angles before anyone has a chance to accidentally wipe it. I also want this gate's employee logs for the last 48 hours and the airline's official protocol for verifying passenger identification. Consider it done, Agent Chen said, already speaking quietly into a wrist-mounted communication device, relaying the instructions. Brenda watched all this unfold as if in a nightmare. The world had tilted on its axis. The woman she had dismissed and humiliated was now directing federal agents with an air of absolute command. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been inverted with breathtaking speed and brutality. This was a hostile takeover of her reality. "Frank," she whimpered, turning to her supervisor, her last hope. "Do something. Tell them. I was just doing my job. I thought it was fake. I was protecting the flight." Frank looked at her, then at the stone-faced federal agents, then at Imani. The calculus of self-preservation was spinning in his head. His instinct to protect his employee was at war with his instinct to save his own skin. The latter was winning by a landslide. "Brenda, what exactly happened here?" he asked, his voice now cautious, devoid of its earlier bluster. He was no longer her defender. He was an investigator trying to find a safe distance from the explosion. She was being difficult," Brenda stammered, casting about for a justification that didn't sound as petty and prejudiced as her true motives. Her story didn't add up. First class, but dressed like that. It was suspicious. Imani overheard this. She turned her head, her gaze locking onto Brenda. "Dressed like that?" She repeated the question, sharp as a shard of glass. "Please clarify for the record, Brenda. What about my attire specifically did you find suspicious? Was it my university sweatshirt? Or was it the fact that a black woman was wearing it in the first-class line? The question was a precision strike, laying the ugly truth of the matter bare for everyone to see. Brenda paled even further. "No, it wasn't that I wouldn't." "You wouldn't what?" Imani pressed, relentless. "You wouldn't judge a passenger based on their race. Your actions and your own words suggest otherwise, and I suspect your employment history will corroborate that." She turned to Agent Chen. "Add a request for the subject's complaint history from Ascend Air HR. I want to see every formal and informal complaint ever filed against her." A small, strangled gasp escaped Brenda's lips. She thought of Mrs. Garcia from last Christmas, whose son had filed a complaint after Brenda refused to let her board with her walker until every other passenger was on the plane. She thought of the young Muslim man she had insisted on having randomly selected for extra screening 3 times in a row. She thought of the countless eye-rolls, sighs, and dismissive comments she had made to people who didn't look or sound like her. Frank had always buried the complaints, smoothed them over, told her to be more careful. He had enabled her. Now all those little acts of malice were about to be exhumed and put on display under the harsh light of a federal investigation. The pilot of Flight 1142. Captain Hayes, a distinguished-looking man with silver hair, had made his way up the jet bridge to see what was causing the delay. He took in the scene, the police, the feds, his ashen-faced gate agent, and approached Frank. "Frank, what in God's name is happening? We've got a full plane waiting to go." "Flight's been grounded, Captain," Agent Davies stated flatly. "This is an active crime scene." Captain Hayes stared at him. "A crime scene over what?" Imani answered. "Your gate agent assaulted a federal officer in the performance of her duties." It was a slight reframing, assaulting an officer by destroying her credentials, but it was technically true and carried the weight she intended. The captain's eyes widened. He looked at Brenda with a new, horrified understanding. The entire flight crew's fate was tied to the airline's performance. An incident like this, a federal investigation launched on the spot, was catastrophic. It would mean audits, interviews, and a black mark on everyone involved. "My apologies, ma'am," he said, addressing Imani directly and respectfully. "On behalf of the crew, I can assure you this is not the standard of service we aspire to." Imani nodded, accepting the politic statement. "Your professionalism is noted, Captain, but the standard of service is no longer the primary issue. We have now moved on to matters of federal compliance and criminal conduct." She turned back to Brenda, who looked like she was about to collapse. The fight was gone. The bravado, a distant memory. All that remained was the pathetic, crumbling facade of a bully who had finally punched someone who could punch back, not with fists, but with the full crushing weight of the United States government. "Brenda," Imani said, her voice dropping back to that eerily calm, almost gentle tone. "You will be escorted to a secure interview room. You have the right to remain silent. I strongly advise you to use it until you have legal counsel. You are going to need it." The words hung in the air, a final, devastating verdict. The script had been flipped, the roles reversed. Brenda, the queen of Gate B-32, was no longer in control. She was a subject, a defendant, a case file. And Imani Vance, the woman in the gray joggers, was the one holding the pen. The transition from public gate area to sterile interview room was swift and disorienting for Brenda. One moment she was surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of her workplace. The next, she was sitting on a hard plastic chair in a windowless beige room. The only furniture was a metal table bolted to the floor and 3 chairs. Agent Chen sat opposite her, a folder and a pen her only props. Agent Davies stood silently by the door. The air was thick with the scent of institutional cleaning supplies and stale regret. Brenda's mind was a frantic scramble. This had to be a misunderstanding, a colossal overreaction. She was a good employee, 22 years with Ascend Air from baggage handler to the coveted position of lead gate agent. She had seniority. She had Frank's protection. This couldn't be happening. "I want to call my husband," she said, her voice thin and reedy. "And I want to talk to Frank." "You will have an opportunity to make a phone call," Agent Chen replied, her tone neutral. She clicked her pen. "Mr. Miller is currently in another room giving his own statement. For now, I just have a few preliminary questions." She opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper with Brenda's employee photo clipped to the top. "Full name for the record is Brenda S. Kowalski." "Yes," Brenda whispered. "And you have been the lead gate agent at this station for 7 years." "Yes." Agent Chen made a small checkmark on her paper. "Ms. Kowalski, in your 2 decades with Ascend Air, how many times have you received training on the Passenger Identification and Verification Protocol, also known as PIV?" I don't know the exact number. Every year we have refreshers." "And what does that protocol instruct you to do if you suspect a passenger's identification is fraudulent?" Brenda's throat felt dry. "We are supposed to use the verification equipment, the UV light, and if doubts remain, we call a supervisor or airport security." "And did you use the verification equipment on Inspector Vance's passport?" "No," Brenda admitted. "The equipment was right there, built into her counter. It would have taken 5 seconds." "And why not?" "Because I just had a feeling. It looked off. The way she was dressed, her attitude, it was all wrong. I was being proactive about security. Agent Chen's face remained impassive, but her eyes were sharp. So you substituted a federally mandated security protocol with a feeling based on what you described to your supervisor as this passenger being dressed like that. It wasn't just that she was arrogant, Brenda said, grasping at straws, challenging my authority. Is it your understanding that a passenger asking you to do your job constitutes a challenge to your authority? Agent Chen countered smoothly. She made another note. Let's move on to the document itself. You stated you believed it to be a cheap forgery. What specific elements of the passport led you to that conclusion? Was the microprinting on the data page flawed? Was the holographic image of the eagle incorrect? Did the binding fail to meet federal standards? Brenda stared at her blankly. She didn't know about any of that. She had glanced at the photo and the name and made a judgment. She had never in 22 years actually studied the security features of a passport. She didn't need to. She just knew. It just looked fake. She mumbled the weakness of her own excuse echoing in the small room. So to be clear, Agent Chen summarized, her voice cutting through the fog of Brenda's panic. With no technical basis, you ignored your training, profiled a passenger based on her appearance and race, and then when questioned, you committed a felony by destroying the very document you were tasked to inspect. Is that an accurate summary of events? The words laid out so plainly were devastating. Brenda felt a wave of nausea. I want a lawyer, she whispered. A wise decision, Agent Chen said, closing the folder. She stood up. You'll be formally processed by airport police. The U.S. Attorney's Office will be in touch regarding the federal charges. As Agent Davies escorted a stunned and sobbing Brenda from the room, Imani was in the station supervisor's office with Frank Miller. It was a cluttered, messy space decorated with dusty awards for on-time departures and photos of Frank shaking hands with various airline executives. Imani sat in his chair behind his desk while he perched nervously on the edge of a visitor's chair. The power reversal was absolute. Agent Davies had brought her the initial printouts she'd requested. The first was the gate security footage synced to an iPad. The second was a thin file. Brenda Kowalski's complaint history. Mr. Miller, Imani began, her voice calm and measured. I've been reviewing your employee's file. In the last 5 years alone, there have been 14 formal complaints lodged against Ms. Kowalski. 9 of them from passengers of color, 4 from passengers with disabilities, and 1 from a passenger who appeared to be of Middle Eastern descent. Frank shifted uncomfortably. We get complaints all the time. It's the nature of customer service. People get upset when they miss flights. Oh, I'm not talking about missed flights, Imani said, her eyes narrowing. I'm talking about a complaint from a Mr. David Chen, who stated that Ms. Kowalski loudly asked if he spoke English when he presented a valid New York driver's license. I'm talking about a complaint from an Aisha Sharma, who alleges Ms. Kowalski lost her seat assignment for her and her 2 children after she requested a child's meal. I'm talking about a complaint from a retired Army sergeant, a double amputee who claims Ms. Kowalski told him he was holding up the line and should have requested wheelchair assistance even though he was perfectly capable of walking with his prosthetics. She pushed the file across the desk. And on every single one of these, Mr. Miller, I see your signature. Action taken, counseled employee. Action taken, verbal warning. Action taken, case closed. Tell me, what did this counseling entail? Frank began to sweat profusely. I spoke with Brenda. I told her she needed to be more careful with her words, that she had to treat everyone with respect. And yet the pattern continued. It escalated, Imani stated. It went from verbal insults to deliberate obstruction, and today it culminated in a criminal act. What you call counseling, Mr. Miller, the FAA calls gross negligence. You were not managing an employee, you were enabling a known liability. You cultivated a culture at this gate where prejudice was permissible as long as the planes left on time. You are as culpable in this as she is. Frank's face, already pale, turned the color of ash. That's not true, I'm a good manager. A good manager, Imani said, leaning forward, does not have an employee who feels empowered to rip up a passenger's passport in front of 50 people. A good manager would have identified this pattern of behavior and removed the threat. You didn't. You buried it. And now it has buried you. She stood up. Your airline's operating certificate is contingent on adherence to federal law and FAA security directives. Those directives include provisions against discriminatory practices as they create volatile and unpredictable security risks. You and your star employee have provided us with a textbook case study. The FAA will be launching a full top-to-bottom audit of this entire Atlanta hub effective immediately. Every log, every employee file, every procedure will be scrutinized. We're going to put your operation under a microscope, Mr. Miller. And I suspect we're going to find a lot more than just one rogue gate agent. Frank stared at her, his world collapsing in on him. The awards on his wall seemed to mock him. His career built on a foundation of cutting corners and looking the other way was about to be systematically dismantled. Imani walked to the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. She turned back to him. Oh, and Mr. Miller, I've watched the security footage. The part where your employee calls me arrogant for asking her to do her job. You can expect a subpoena to testify about that under oath. I'd start thinking very carefully about what your definition of counseling really means. She walked out, leaving him alone in the cluttered office, the silence broken only by the frantic, panicked thumping of his own heart. The unraveling had begun, and it was going to be faster and more painful than he could ever have imagined. Imani Vance's promise of putting the Ascend Air Atlanta hub under a microscope was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. Within hours, what began with a torn passport at Gate B32 metastasized into a full-scale federal audit. The FAA, moving with the kind of bureaucratic speed reserved for genuine emergencies, descended on Hartsfield-Jackson. They weren't the usual clipboard and checklist auditors. This was the National Security and Incident Response Team, the sharp end of the spear. Imani established a command center in a corporate conference room commandeered from Ascend Air. The room quickly filled with laptops, secure servers, and a team of investigators hand-picked for their ruthlessness in sniffing out non-compliance. They were forensic accountants, ex-NTSB investigators, and data security analysts. They were the people airlines have nightmares about. The investigation radiated outward from Brenda Kowalski. Her work computer was imaged, her email server seized. They found a trove of emails between her and Frank Miller, a sordid history of complaints met with winking reassurances. "Don't worry about the Chen guy, I handled it," one of Frank's emails read. "Just try to keep it less obvious next time, LOL." The LOL was a nail in his coffin. But Brenda was just the loose thread. As Imani's team pulled on it, the entire tapestry of the Atlanta station began to unravel. The audit of employee files, which Frank had so ineptly guarded, revealed that Brenda's case wasn't an anomaly. It was just the most egregious example. They found other employees with disturbing patterns, a baggage-handling supervisor who consistently lost the luggage of passengers with African or Middle Eastern-sounding names, a ticketing agent who had a statistically impossible record of assigning minority families to middle seats, even on empty flights. These were all small acts of degradation, paper cuts of prejudice that had been ignored or dismissed by management focused solely on metrics like on-time departure rates. "This isn't a bad apple problem. It's an orchard problem," Imani stated during a briefing with her team 2 days into the audit. She stood before a whiteboard covered in diagrams and flowcharts connecting names and incidents. "The culture here fostered by Miller and his predecessors is one of willful blindness. Compliance is seen as a suggestion, not a mandate. The priority is profit and speed. Everything else, including security and basic human dignity, is secondary." The most damning discovery came from the maintenance logs. An analyst cross-referencing parts inventory with flight records found discrepancies. Small ones at first, but the pattern was undeniable. Ascend Air's Atlanta station was cutting corners. They were extending the service life of non-critical parts beyond the manufacturer's recommendations. They were pencil-whipping inspections, signing off on checks that were never actually performed. They uncovered the case of Flight 819 from 3 months prior, a flight to Seattle that had to make an emergency landing in Denver due to a cabin pressure sensor failure. The official report, signed by Frank Miller, blamed an unforeseeable parts malfunction. The FAA audit found the truth: the sensor that failed was on its 3rd life extension, 2 past the legal limit. The inspection report for its last check was signed by a mechanic who was, according to payroll records, on vacation in the Bahamas on the day of the alleged inspection. Frank Miller had not just ignored racism. He had actively participated in a cover-up that endangered the lives of hundreds of passengers. The torn passport was no longer the main crime. It was merely the key that had unlocked a vault of systemic corruption. Imani sat down with Captain Hayes, the pilot from the cancelled Flight 1142. He had been grounded pending the investigation along with his crew. He was angry, embarrassed, and terrified for his career. "Captain," Imani began, her tone professional, but not unkind. "I've reviewed your record. It's exemplary. 25 years, not a single blemish. Which is why I find it hard to believe you were completely unaware of the lax culture at this station." Hayes shifted in his seat. "My job is in the cockpit, Vance. I fly the plane. I rely on my ground crew and my station managers to do their jobs to the letter. I have to trust them." "Trust is not a control," Imani countered. "It's a variable. Did you ever in your pre-flight checks notice anything that gave you pause? Any maintenance sign-offs that seemed rushed? Any crew members who seemed overly stressed or complained about being understaffed?" The captain hesitated. His loyalty was to his crew and his airline, but his ultimate responsibility was to the safety of his passengers, and he was speaking to a federal investigator who already seemed to know the answers to her own questions. "There have been whispers," he admitted reluctantly. "Talk of management pushing us to make faster turnarounds, pressure to not delay flights for minor write-ups. We're told to use our discretion, but I never saw anything that I believed would compromise the safety of my aircraft." "And Brenda Kowalski? What were the whispers about her?" Captain Hayes sighed a deep, weary sound. "Everyone knew about Brenda. We called her the gatekeeper. She had her favorites. If you were on her good side, your boarding was smooth as silk. If not, it wasn't. We just tried to stay out of her way. It was easier than fighting with her and getting Frank involved." "So you were aware of her behavior," Imani concluded. "And you and others made a conscious choice to ignore it for the sake of an easier day. That, Captain, is called complicity. It's the soil in which people like Brenda and Frank grow." The words hit the captain like a physical blow. He had always thought of himself as one of the good guys, a man of integrity. But Imani was showing him that integrity wasn't a passive state. It was an active choice. And he, along with many others, had failed to make it. The investigation was no longer about a single incident. It was about the insidious rot that can fester in a large organization when profit is prioritized over people, when accountability is sacrificed for convenience, and when small acts of prejudice are allowed to go unchecked, creating an environment where larger crimes can take root. Imani looked at the mountain of evidence her team had compiled, the falsified logs, the history of complaints, the damning emails. It all started with one woman's ugly assumption about another woman's place in the world. It was a stark, terrifying reminder of a truth she had built her career on. Bigotry isn't just a social evil. In the world of aviation, it is a direct and pressing threat to safety and security. It is a cancer that, left untreated, will always eventually spread. The consequences came not with a single thunderclap, but as a series of devastating, targeted lightning strikes. The final report from Operation Safe Skies, with the Ascend Air Atlanta hub as its grim centerpiece, was a masterwork of methodical destruction. It was leaked to a major news outlet, a strategic move by Imani's boss, Director Evans, to ensure the story couldn't be buried. And the fallout was immediate and catastrophic. For Brenda Kowalski, the karma was swift and absolute. Fired by Ascend Air within an hour of the story breaking, she was arrested the next day. The image of her being led from her suburban home in handcuffs, her face a crumpled mask of disbelief, became the visual icon of the scandal. She was charged with the destruction of a federal document, but the U.S. attorney, spurred by the public outcry and the mountain of evidence of her discriminatory practices, added civil rights charges to the indictment. Her feeling about Imani Vance would cost her years of her life. Her legal defense crumbled when Frank Miller, in a desperate bid for leniency, agreed to testify against her, detailing his years of counseling that were nothing more than a conspiratorial pat on the back. Frank Miller's fate was in many ways worse. He was also fired and faced federal charges not just for his role in the passport incident, but for the far more serious crime of falsifying safety records. The FAA made an example of him. They didn't just want him to lose his job. They wanted to ensure he could never work in the aviation industry again in any capacity. His name became a byword for managerial negligence. Facing decades in prison for endangering hundreds of lives with his pencil-whipped inspections, he took a plea bargain, receiving a multi-year sentence in federal prison. The man who lived by the corporate ladder died by it, his fall as spectacular as it was deserved. But the true karma was reserved for Ascend Air. The FAA hit them with one of the largest fines in the agency's history, a figure with so many zeros it made Wall Street analysts gasp. The fine wasn't just punitive, it was prescriptive. A significant portion of the money was earmarked for a complete top-to-bottom overhaul of their training compliance and hiring practices, all to be monitored by a court-appointed federal overseer for a period of 5 years. Imani Vance herself helped write the terms of the settlement. The airline's stock plummeted. Passengers boycotted. The PR nightmare was relentless. The story of the racist gate agent who tore up a passport became a national cautionary tale. The Ascend Air brand, once associated with budget-friendly travel, was now synonymous with prejudice and corruption. They were forced to launch a humiliating apology tour, with their CEO appearing on national television, his face a grimace of forced contrition. The young woman who had filmed the initial incident on her phone became a minor celebrity. Her video was played on every news channel, a clear, damning record of Brenda's malice. She was interviewed, praised for her quick thinking, and held up as an example of citizen journalism. She later received a quiet, personal note of thanks from Imani. 6 months later, Imani Vance stood at a podium in a congressional hearing room on Capitol Hill. She was no longer in her undercover sweats, but in a sharply tailored navy blue suit. Her demeanor was confident, her voice clear and strong as it echoed through the chamber. On a large screen behind her was a high-resolution image of her ripped passport, the two halves now a symbol of a broken system. The events at Hartsfield-Jackson were not the result of one employee's bad day, she told the committee of senators. They were the inevitable result of a corporate culture that tolerated bigotry, prioritized speed over safety, and ignored the fundamental principle that security is compromised the moment we begin to make assumptions based on a person's race, religion, or appearance. The actions of Ms. Kowalski were not just an insult to me personally. They were an affront to every citizen who trusts us to keep them safe. They were a direct threat to the integrity of our national aviation system. She detailed the findings of the audit, the systemic rot her team had uncovered, and the steps being taken to fix it. She spoke with passion and precision, her every word backed by a mountain of undeniable fact. She was no longer just an investigator. She was a reformer, a force for change. After the hearing, as she packed her briefcase, a young African-American congressional aide approached her, her eyes shining with admiration. "Vance," she said, her voice full of emotion. "Thank you for not backing down, for what you did." Imani offered a small, genuine smile. She thought of the humiliation at the gate, the cold fury that had filled her, and the long, exhausting months that had followed. "I just did my job," she replied. As she walked out into the bright DC sunlight, she felt a sense of profound, weary satisfaction. The karma that had struck Brenda Frank and Ascend Air wasn't mystical or magical. It was methodical. It was procedural. It was the simple, powerful consequence of a system when forced finally holding the corrupt to account. It was the hard-earned result of one woman refusing to be invisible, and in doing so, ensuring that the ugly rot she had exposed would finally be brought into the light. The story of Imani Vance and Brenda the gate agent is a powerful reminder that the most significant battles are often fought not in war rooms, but in the everyday spaces where prejudice is allowed to fester. It shows how one person's courage can trigger an avalanche of accountability, exposing the systemic rot that hides behind a corporate logo and a plastic name tag. The karma that came for Brenda and her enablers wasn't just satisfying. It was a necessary cleansing, a painful but vital course correction. It proves that ignorance and hate, when challenged by integrity and relentless professionalism, will always eventually crumble.